It was supposed to be a celebration, my wife Cambria's birthday party. I'd spent the afternoon straightening my tie in the mirror, promising myself I'd keep a pleasant smile pasted on no matter what. Felix had spared no expense. A live jazz band crooned beneath a canopy of string lights, an open bar gleamed under the terrace lanterns, and more than 100 guests mingled around the manicured gardens of the Burton estate. I stood on the edge of the terrace, a glass of vintage red in hand, pretending I belonged. In truth, I felt like a charity case invited to observe someone else's life. I raised the glass to my lips, letting the burgundy liquid coat my tongue, willing myself to taste celebration. But beneath the happy chatter and the clink of ice against crystal, something gnawed at me. Those glances Cambria shot my way, equal parts pity and annoyance. I forced my features into a polite grin as her friends fluttered around her like moths to a flame, whispering compliments and sipping champagne. Cambria was the queen tonight, and I was the footman whose only job was to stand still and look appreciative. Then came Felix, swaggering over with the self-confidence of a man who knows exactly how much power he wields. His tailored suit hugged his frame, his cufflinks winked like trophies, and his breath reeked faintly of scotch. I braced myself, hoping for a cordial greeting. Instead, he tipped his head, the candlelight and the bottles behind him casting a halo around his smug grin. "Dean," he drawled, voice thick with alcohol, "why are you still here?" He paused, letting the laughter of his cronies wash over me. Nobody likes the charity case husband. I laughed it off, the kind of hollow chuckle that echoes in an empty room. I lifted my glass in a mock toast. "Happy birthday, Felix," I said, voice calm, measured. But every muscle in my body tensed. In that moment, I saw the hardness in Cambria's eyes, the way her lips curled at the edges but never fully smiled. I nodded as Felix turned on his heel, swaggering back to his crowd, and I set my glass on a nearby ledge, watching the red wine tremble. Moments later, the celebration crashed. I barely saw the flash of brown glass arcing through the lamplight. 1 second, I was stepping forward to catch my balance. The next, the world exploded against the side of my head. Pain ripped through me in a hot, blinding wave. I tasted copper, metallic, bitter. The glass shattered on impact, spraying crimson droplets across the pristine marble floor. There was a collective gasp, a dozen screams, and then silence so complete it rang in my ears. My hand flew to my temple, sticky with blood that seeped through my fingers. The guests parted around me like the Red Sea. In the distance, the band's smooth melody slid out of harmony, replaced by the urgent hum of shock. I looked up, searching for Cambria in the crowd, but she stood rooted at the fringe, arms crossed, watching me as if I were an exhibit behind glass. She didn't scream. She didn't rush to me. She only turned away, shoulders squared, letting Felix's laughter tumble over her retreating back. Time slowed. I blinked twice, tasting the metallic sting on my tongue, and the resolve inside me crystallized. I took one step toward Cambria, but the dizziness pulled me back. Fragments of glass crunched beneath my shoes. Guests scattered, whispers chasing one another. "Call an ambulance. Did you see that?" I can't believe it. I felt entirely alone, both the victim and the outsider in a scene choreographed without my permission. I left the chaos behind, my phone and keys the only things I managed to pocket. My suit was ruined, blood speckles staining the charcoal wool, but I barely noticed. The night air hit me as I crossed the terrace threshold, cool and cleansing. I inhaled deeply, drawing the scent of night-blooming jasmine and freshly trimmed hedges into my lungs. With each breath, the shock receded and something harder took root. Indignation, fury, determination. I'd spent years apologizing for being less than perfect in her world, sacrificing my own needs on the altar of her family's expectations. No more. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaky, and dialed Cambria's number even though I knew she wouldn't answer. I listened to the ringing echo through the empty hallway beside the terrace, then let it go. I slid my keys into my pocket and pushed through the back door, stepping out onto the lawn where the last of the party's lights winked in the distance. I walked away from the music, away from the laughter, away from the betrayal, letting the estate shrink behind me until all I could see were swaying hedgerows under the moonlight. By the time I reached the end of the gravel drive, I had made my decision. I would not return to that party, to that life, or to that marriage as it had been. The sting on my temple throbbed with each heartbeat, reminding me of the precise moment everything changed. I was no longer just Cambria's husband or Felix's punching bag. I was a man scorned, but no longer broken. I climbed into my car, slamming the door shut as the thunder of my own pulse drowned out the world. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw the estate's silhouette framed by broken glass glinting like stars in the marble doorway. I held my breath, then exhaled. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. My phone lay silent beside me. My keys jingled in my hand, and I pressed the accelerator, driving away with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I didn't glance back. 3 hours after the party ended in blood and silence, I sat in a quiet office 12 stories above downtown, the fluorescent lights humming faintly above my head. The receptionist had offered me coffee I hadn't touched. My shirt, blood-stained at the collar, was hidden beneath a borrowed black hoodie from the EMT who'd clean me up. I could still feel the dried sting near my temple, a dull pulse reminding me I wasn't here by accident. I was here because I'd had enough. Rowan Ellison's office didn't scream power. It whispered it. The walls were lined with books. Actual books, not decorative leather-bound sets, but well-thumbed legal volumes and case law compilations with color-coded tabs sticking out at odd angles. A single potted plant leaned toward the sliver of city skyline, and a framed quote hung above her desk. The most dangerous voice is the one that doesn't need to yell. I hadn't even sat down yet when I realized I was no longer alone in this war. Rowan was nothing like the bloodthirsty lawyers on TV. She looked like a librarian. Thin spectacles, a high bun, soft cardigan over a gray blouse, but the way she watched me, like she was already organizing facts into arguments, made me sit straighter. My college roommate had recommended her with a simple text, "She's quiet, but lethal." I now understood both parts of that statement. "I read your intake form," she said without preamble, her voice calm and deliberate. "And your message. You said your wife's brother assaulted you in public, during a party held at her family estate?" "Yes," I replied. "Birthday party. Her birthday." She nodded. "And your wife didn't intervene?" "She turned away," I said, hating how small the words sounded. She looked at me for a long moment, her pen still. "Let's start at the beginning, Mr. Langford. I need everything. Emotional history, financial records, assets, property access. I'll ask specific questions later." I paused, unsure how to summarize years of being muted by politeness and manipulated by charm. But I started anyway. I told her about Cambria's slow withdrawal after our second anniversary, the way affection became performance, the way I stopped being a husband and became a sponsor. I told her how Felix had always undermined me in ways that felt like jokes until they didn't. I explained how I'd been gradually cut out of decision-making, vacations planned without consulting me, purchases made in my name, then labeled ours. I handed over a folder I'd stuffed into my bag before leaving the house for the party. A habit I hadn't realized would serve a purpose. Inside were years of documentation, copies of property taxes I'd paid, emails where I was looped into renovation discussions but never allowed a vote, transfer confirmations for shared assets that bore only Cambria's name. Rowan flipped through the stack with the practiced eye of someone who had seen worse. Maybe not blood at a birthday, but enough paper-cut betrayals to know what they built toward. She stopped at one page, slid her glasses down slightly, then looked at me. "You financed the East Wing renovation?" "Yes. And this invoice, $47,000 for the driveway redesign. Paid from your personal account." I nodded. "Felix said they needed to upgrade the welcome experience." Her lips tightened. "But you're not on the deed." "No. The house belonged to Cambria's family. Technically, it still does." I laughed dryly. "At least, that's what I thought." She leaned back, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "What if I told you that wasn't necessarily true?" I stared at her. "Come again." Rowan pulled a slim tablet from a drawer and began tapping through a database. Cambria's father, Lawrence Burton, retired finance executive, died 5 years ago. Yes, liver cancer. Before he died, he created a revocable living trust. That's standard. But here's where it gets interesting. She turned the tablet around to face me. A scanned document filled the screen, stamped and signed. "This is a partial summary of the Burton Family Estate Trust. You see this clause?" I squinted. Section 14. In the event of criminal activity or physical harm enacted by a named family member upon an in-law or legal spouse within estate grounds, the property may transfer. Wait, what? Rowan smiled, a small, dangerous thing. You were assaulted on estate grounds by Felix, a named beneficiary, and because of that, there's a trigger clause in the trust. It was likely inserted as a safeguard. A family with money, property, and too many secrets? Lawrence probably wanted a way to protect the estate's integrity. He likely never expected the trigger to be used. I blinked. So what are you saying? I'm saying we have a case, she said. And more than that, you have leverage. If we can confirm the terms of the trust and connect the dots, assault, witness statements, your financial contributions, we may be able to legally transfer the deed. At the very least, we can freeze it. You'd be the rightful inheritor under that clause. I sat back in the leather chair, stunned. So, all this time, I thought I had nothing. You have quite a lot, Rowan said. You've just never had someone help you claim it. For the first time in years, I felt the sensation of something shifting, like the ground beneath my feet was no longer giving way. I wasn't just bleeding and humiliated in a back seat of a police cruiser, dismissed as a nobody. I was a man who had been wronged in plain sight. And now, for the first time, I had the law on my side. I'll need witness statements from the party, Rowan continued, flipping back through the folder. Any video footage would help. Also, credit card statements, transfer logs, and anything that places your name beside significant financial input. We're going to build this not like a divorce case, but like a hostile claim. My breath caught. A hostile claim? Yes, she said calmly. You didn't walk away empty-handed, Dean. You walked away with cause. And now? You might walk back in with a deed. The words settled into my bones like a secret oath. I remembered Felix's smirk as the bottle arced toward my temple. I remembered Cambria's cool detachment. I had thought I was leaving that night with nothing but bruises and regret. But Rowan had just shown me that what I left with was far more valuable: evidence, rights, and most dangerously of all, a plan. She handed me a paper to sign, formalizing our retainer. I'll take care of the legal approach. You'll need to go silent for a while. No warnings. No calls to Cambria. No confrontations. Let them think you disappeared. The quieter you are, the harder they'll fall when we move. I signed the page without hesitation. Rowan's pen clicked shut, her expression unreadable. But when she stood to shake my hand, her grip was firm. I don't yell, Mr. Langford, she said again, but I do win. And in that moment, I knew this wouldn't be revenge. It would be justice, signed and sealed. It started with a signature I didn't even remember giving. Rowan had been digging through public records, probate documents, anything linked to the Burtons' estate. I had assumed, like everyone else, that the house was permanently tied to Cambria's family line. I'd accepted that I was an outsider in every way that mattered. But what Rowan found rewrote the script. We were sitting across from each other in her office again. She slid a manila folder across the polished desk toward me, her expression calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes I'd come to recognize. It meant something important had surfaced. Cambria's father didn't just hand the property to his kids, she said. He put it into a revocable trust before he passed. That's not uncommon. But what is uncommon, very uncommon, is the conditions he attached to it. She opened the folder to a copy of the trust deed. The paper looked like any other legal document, dense, formal, lifeless. But when Rowan pointed to the clause, it came alive. This section right here. It stipulates that if a legal spouse of one of the beneficiaries is subject to criminal harm or assault by another beneficiary on estate property, the trustee has the right to transfer ownership to that spouse. My heart ticked louder in my ears as I read the words. They were all there. Legal, specific, binding. A bill and insurance policy against violence. A clause that had likely seemed like overkill when it was drafted, but now, suddenly, was a loaded weapon I hadn't known I possessed. And here, Rowan said, flipping to the last page, is your signature. You signed as a witness when this was drafted. You were there. You knew about this at one point, Dean. I stared at the signature. My own handwriting, plain as daylight. My name, followed by a date from 5 years ago, just a month before Lawrence Burton died. And suddenly, the memory slid back into place like a key fitting a forgotten lock. It was a rainy Tuesday. We were all gathered in the estate sunroom, Lawrence wrapped in a shawl, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The lawyer, Grant Miles, had come by with a stack of documents. Cambria had been arguing about something, probably the wine cellar renovations. Felix was pacing the room. Lawrence asked me quietly if I would sign as a witness. I remember thinking it was an honor, that it meant he trusted me with something important. I hadn't asked what the trust included. I just signed and shook Grant's hand. Dean. Rowan's voice broke the memory. I nodded slowly. I remember now. I didn't know what I was signing. I mean, I wasn't told the specifics. Lawrence was not well, but he was clear-headed that day. He said it was just a formality. Formalities have consequences, Rowan said, especially when they're attached to trust law. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the page like it might combust. So what happens next? I spoke to Grant Miles. He's still alive. Still practicing, actually. Semi-retired. When I told him what happened to you, Felix's assault, he didn't sound surprised. Said he always knew Lawrence included the clause for a reason. He remembered me? He remembered you as the one person who didn't talk over him. Said Lawrence always liked you more than his own son. That caught in my throat. I looked down again at the document and the looping curve of my signature. I had been a footnote in that family for so long. I hadn't considered I could ever be more. But now, it was written in black and white. The bottle Felix smashed over my head had triggered something much bigger than a hospital visit. It had opened a legal door Lawrence himself had designed. Rowan flipped the folder shut. We have everything we need to start the process. Miles agreed to send an affidavit confirming the trust is still valid and that he oversaw your signature. The next step is filing a petition for emergency transfer of ownership due to a breach of the trust conditions. And Cambria? She won't see it coming. Which is the point. I laughed, not out of amusement, but out of disbelief. She's going to lose the house because her brother couldn't keep his ego in check. Rowan didn't smile. She's going to lose it because she stood by while it happened. That clause doesn't just punish the offender, it protects the innocent. You have proof of harm, witnesses, medical records. And this clause? It's iron. I picked up the folder and held it in both hands like it was something fragile, even though it had the weight of a sledgehammer. I want to do this right, I said. No theatrics. No public fights. I want this clean. Then we let them make the next move, Rowan said. We file quietly. Let the documents arrive before you do. Let the facts speak. Let them unravel. That night, I sat alone in my temporary apartment, the one I'd rented under a different name just days after the party. I stared at the trust documents again under the dim kitchen light, drinking cheap scotch out of a coffee mug. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't feel like the charity husband or the tolerated tag-along. I felt like a man holding a match just inches from a fuse. Cambria had spent years polishing her image, curating a perfect life around a marriage she never really honored. And now that same carefully built life was perched on top of a forgotten signature and a broken bottle. The irony was almost poetic. She'd underestimated me so deeply that she never bothered to see what I was actually holding. The signature I'd forgotten was no longer buried under time and paperwork. It was in my hands now, and I was going to use it. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming something that had always been mine. Not the house, not the title, but the right to be seen, respected, and counted. The trust clause was written for a moment just like this. A moment when truth mattered more than appearances. When paper carried more weight than performance. And I was ready. Rowan told me to disappear, not vanish entirely, but to go quiet, to move like smoke and wait. I followed every word. No calls to Cambria. No texts. No social media updates. I withdrew from everything we shared. I packed the essentials into a rented apartment 30 minutes from the city and left the rest behind. Clothes, furniture, reminders. I even switched to a prepaid phone. To the world, I had simply fallen off the grid. But behind the scenes, the gears of something far more calculated were grinding into motion. I spent my mornings at a small cafe on East Alder, where no one knew my name, and the coffee was just bitter enough to keep me alert. I brought my laptop, but rarely opened it. Most days I just watched people, movement, rhythm. The world didn't pause because I was nursing a head wound and betrayal. It moved on, and in that motion, I began to find my footing again. Cambria didn't know I was alive in this new version of myself. She posted pictures from brunches and rooftop dinners. Felix made an appearance in her stories again, shirtless by a pool, smirking into a cocktail. There was no hint of a public apology, no acknowledgement of what happened. Not one post even hinted at that night. Just more of the curated perfection they clung to. I didn't comment. I didn't watch them for pain. I watched them to learn. Rowan was always 3 steps ahead. She moved like water, smooth and relentless. While I laid low, she filed the emergency motion to initiate review of the trust clause. Felix's assault was documented in the hospital records. We had the medical reports. 2 witnesses from the party had quietly confirmed what they saw: a bottle, a blow, blood. One had even filmed part of it. The video was short but damning. Felix stumbling forward, Cambria frozen, my body crumpling out of frame. Meanwhile, Rowan froze the estate's transaction capabilities. No funds could move in or out of the property trust without a court sign-off. The accounts attached to the Burton property, tax, maintenance, insurance, were all being monitored. It was subtle, surgical. There were no alarms blaring, just a slow tightening of strings. Cambria texted me 3 times that first week. Tuesday, are you okay? Thursday, Dean, can we talk? Sunday, I don't know where you are, but this isn't like you. She was right. It wasn't like me. I had always been available. I had always answered, explained, de-escalated. But Rowan's advice echoed in my mind. Let them wonder. Let them panic just enough to reveal their hand. So I let the silence speak. By the second week, the calls began, missed ones, voicemails left at odd hours. One of them was Cambria's mother. Dean, we're all worried. I know you and Felix had a disagreement, but we can move past it. Call us. The word disagreement landed like acid. A shattered bottle to the skull was now a spat between brothers-in-law. The rewrite had already begun, but I didn't bite. I stayed invisible, watching from the sidelines as they reshaped the story. It didn't matter, because the paperwork was already in. The request for trust enforcement had been filed, along with the video, the statements, and my own declaration. The court date was quietly scheduled. Felix and Cambria hadn't even received the notice yet. I spent my evenings walking, around my block, down unfamiliar streets, past dimly lit parks and gas stations where no one knew my name. I needed the silence. I needed to hear myself think after years of being drowned out. Each night, I unpacked pieces of myself I hadn't touched in a long time. I remembered things I'd stopped dreaming about. My own company, my own ambitions, the version of me that wasn't tethered to status and appearances. I didn't miss Cambria's world. I missed who I was before I shrank to fit into it. Rowan called every few days with updates, each one sharper than the last. Grant Miles confirmed in writing that the clause is still binding. His notarized affidavit carries weight. She paused, and Cambria's name is absent from all the financing attached to renovations in the last 5 years. It's all you, Dean. That strengthens your claim. I thought so, I said, the numbness lifting a little more with every confirmation. I was the ghost who paid the bills. Now it's time they realized the ghost holds the keys. Week 3 was when things started to shift. The legal documents were officially served. Not by me, but by the court. Felix would receive the notice first, since he was the named aggressor in the breach clause. Cambria's would arrive the same day. Rowan planned it that way. They won't see it coming, she told me. They think you're licking your wounds. Let them. I imagine the moment. Felix on his phone, tossing papers aside like junk mail, until his eyes snag on the official seal. Until he sees my name. Until he reads the part that says petitioner seeks transfer of full property ownership per Clause 14 of the Burton Family Trust due to verified criminal assault. I imagine the color draining from his face, the blood rushing up his neck. Cambria trying to spin it, to rationalize, only to find her carefully constructed scaffolding giving way. I didn't smile at the thought. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it for clarity, for the truth to finally cut through the performance. I didn't need their apology. I needed distance. And this was how I would get it, with silence, with strategy, with truth on paper, and a quiet lawyer who never raised her voice. By the end of that 3rd week, I stood in front of the mirror in my small, rented apartment. The scar on my temple had faded, but the memory hadn't. I touched it briefly, not to dwell, but to remember. Pain had brought me here, but it wasn't pain that would carry me forward. It was resolve. The next time I walked through that estate gate, it wouldn't be as a tolerated guest or an accessory to someone else's fantasy. It would be as someone who had earned the right to take up space. As someone who had been denied, dismissed, and finally decided not to shrink anymore. The silence had done its job. Now the storm was coming, and I was ready. It was a Tuesday when Felix's world began to crack. The process server arrived just after noon, dressed like a delivery man, polished, polite, unnoticed until the last moment. Felix was lounging near the patio, shirtless, sunglasses on, drink in hand, probably planning another one of his social media diatribes disguised as charm. When the man handed him the envelope, Felix signed for it with a lazy smirk, still half sure it was an invitation or maybe a fine. The look on his face when he opened it, though, that's the image I'll keep framed in my mind. His mouth twisted. His eyes darted. The bravado drained out of him like someone had cut the cord on his self-importance. He called Cambria instantly. I wasn't there to witness it in person, of course, but Rowan's security team was. A discreet presence, arranged days earlier, parked at the end of the driveway, positioned with clear instructions. The moment the documents were received, they were to notify the gate staff. By the time Cambria's car sped up the road, kicking gravel beneath its tires, the new access list had already been implemented. Her name was not on it. She arrived in a panic, hair tied back in a messy twist, wearing a designer trench coat like armor. She barely spoke to the guards, just flashed her ID and said, "I live here." But they didn't move, didn't open the gate. One of them, a firm-eyed man named Malik who'd served as Rowan's point of contact, simply handed her a folded sheet of paper and said, "You'll need to speak to Dean Langford. Access has been temporarily revoked pending legal review." I got the call the moment she started raising her voice. She didn't scream, but her tone turned sharp. Controlled fury, honed from years of getting her way with a narrowed brow and just enough condescension to make people shrink. But the guards didn't shrink. They held the line, calm and unmoved. Malik called me after she left. She looked stunned, he said. Didn't even ask twice. Just turned and walked off. That same afternoon, Cambria tried to call me. I let it ring. Rowan and I watched it all unfold from her office, where she had pulled up a split screen of timestamps and photos sent in by the gate cameras. It felt surreal, seeing the estate from a distance, the house I once poured thousands into, the driveway I'd helped redesign, now locked off from the very people who had paraded me as accessory and bank account. Rowan leaned back in her chair, watching calmly as I studied the images. "She's going to try to spin it," she said. "She'll say you're unhinged, that this is a stunt. But the documents are already processed. The court date is set, and the emergency injunction was approved. They can't re-enter without triggering a breach of court order." I stared at the screen. Cambria's face looked different somehow, less composed. Or maybe I was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "She's going to say I blindsided her." "She'll be right," Rowan replied with a small smile. "That's the point." Felix's reaction, on the other hand, was less controlled. According to neighbors, one of whom sent a message to my private inbox with no words, just a video, he screamed loud enough for the entire block to hear. The video was blurry, but you could see him pacing in front of the fountain, flailing a piece of paper in one hand and holding a phone in the other. At one point, he slammed the gate intercom with his palm, as if force would override legality. It didn't. I didn't respond to the video. I didn't reply to the neighbor, but I saved the footage. Sometimes silence needs documentation. Cambria called again that evening. For rings. Voicemail. Then she texted, "Cambria, Dean, this is ridiculous. Please call me." I didn't reply. I just read it and let it sit there. A relic of the woman who once couldn't make time to attend marriage counseling but suddenly had the time to plead now that consequences were involved. That night, I went for a long walk through my new neighborhood. The air was cool. The sidewalks quiet. I passed a florist closing up shop and a kid bouncing a basketball by himself under a street lamp. The world was still turning, untouched by Cambria's panic. And mine? It had dissolved. Not into vengeance, but into clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. When I got back to my apartment, I found another message waiting. "Cambria, I don't know what you think you're doing. This isn't how adults solve things." I laughed out loud at that one. The irony. The woman whose silence had once felt like punishment now couldn't stop talking. She'd spent years watching me give and give, never thinking I'd ever stop. She didn't notice when I began to step back. She just assumed I'd be there, like a reliable coat you throw on when it rains. I poured myself a glass of wine, cheap stuff, nothing like the bottles that used to line our cellar, and stood by the window, watching the glow of distant headlights flicker along the freeway. Everything felt quiet, not just around me, but inside. That stillness you only get when you finally stop bleeding. Rowan called late to confirm the paperwork had been received and filed into the system. "You'll have temporary legal control until the hearing," she said. "They can't make decisions about the property. You can, within reason. Utilities, security, even light renovations if needed." "Felix, is losing his mind. His lawyer called mine. Rattled. I told them to speak to the class. And Cambria. Quiet. For now. I hung up and stood there for a long time, watching the city exhale. That house, the one I'd helped build, fix, beautify, wasn't a prize. It was a symbol. A scar, maybe. But now it was a battleground, and I wasn't backing away. They thought they'd broken me the night the bottle shattered. But all they'd really done was break the illusion that I was powerless. Now, they had to knock on a door they no longer had a key to, and I didn't even have to open it. 3 weeks to the day after the bottle shattered against my skull, I walked up the cobblestone driveway of the Burton estate wearing a clean navy suit, freshly shined shoes, and a new scar hidden just beneath the edge of my trimmed hairline. The sun cast long shadows over the lawn, catching the gold accents of the wrought iron gates behind me as they clicked shut. My heart thudded, but it didn't race. Not with panic, not with doubt, just purpose. Rowan was beside me, her tablet case tucked under her arm, heels clicking a steady rhythm as we made our way toward the front entrance. My breath stayed even. I'd had 3 weeks to rehearse this moment, and I wasn't going to waste a single second of it. Felix was already outside, pacing like a man trapped in a maze he didn't realize he built. His shirt was rumpled, the top buttons undone, and he wore that expression of disbelief that wealthy people only seem to conjure when someone tells them no for the first time. Cambria trailed behind him, trying to keep up, her mouth working in silent protest as they spotted me approaching. Her eyes locked on mine, wider than I'd ever seen them, not with anger, but with something like recognition. Like she was seeing me clearly for the first time and realizing I'd changed. I didn't speak at first. I didn't have to. Rowan stepped forward and handed Felix a thick envelope. These are certified court documents confirming Mr. Langford's temporary legal control of the Burton estate pursuant to Clause 14 of the Family Trust, she said, crisp and professional. The emergency hearing was reviewed and approved. You are no longer authorized to reside here. You're insane, Felix snapped, his voice cracking as he yanked the envelope from her hand. You can't just walk in here and take over our house. Actually, Rowan replied coolly, he can. And he has. It's been legally transferred pending final hearing. You're trespassing as of this moment. Cambria stepped forward, eyes pleading now. Dean, please. We can talk about this. This isn't you. You don't need to do it this way. I smiled faintly. Not out of pettiness, but out of resolve. You didn't even flinch when your brother split my head open with a bottle. You didn't look at me. You turned away. Her face crumpled for a split second before she masked it again with practiced elegance. You left. You didn't say anything. You didn't give me a chance to explain. You had years to speak, Cambria, I said. You spent them perfecting silence. Felix scoffed, tossing the envelope onto the marble steps. This is a joke. This is some pathetic revenge scheme. I stepped forward then, standing just inches from him, my voice level. You attacked me in front of 100 people. You humiliated me, and you didn't care who saw. Now you care because you're losing something that was never really yours. He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand and spoke louder. For anyone within earshot, gardeners, security, maybe even the neighbors across the estate walls. You break bottles, I said. I break patterns. There was a beat of silence. Rowan's eyes flicked toward the front door. A member of the newly assigned security team stepped out and gave a short nod. The locks had already been changed. Felix and Cambria no longer had access codes, and the staff had been briefed on the transition. I suggest you gather your belongings, Rowan said to them both. What you can carry, you may take. Anything else will be held in inventory for legal arbitration. We have a moving service scheduled if you wish to arrange delivery. You have 3 hours. Cambria looked like she might cry, but no tears came. Only trembling lips and the faint flush of humiliation. She stepped closer. Dean, we were married. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I tilted my head. It did. It meant everything to me. Until it didn't mean anything to you. She swallowed hard, but didn't speak again. Felix muttered something under his breath and stormed inside, the heavy front door slamming behind him. The sound echoed through the courtyard like a final note in a song no one wanted to sing anymore. Rowan turned to me then, her voice softening. You're officially in possession. Do you want to go inside? I nodded. We walked through the front door, past the ornate foyer Cambria had obsessed over for years. The chandelier still hung like an accusation. I climbed the grand staircase, each step echoing with memory. Birthdays, arguments, the sound of Cambria's heels clicking as she walked away from hard conversations. But today, it felt different. The air felt lighter, like someone had opened a window in a sealed room. In the master suite, I opened the balcony doors and stepped outside. The wind was soft, brushing against my face like it hadn't touched me in years. I looked out over the manicured grounds and let myself breathe. For the first time since that bottle shattered, I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I had stood up. I had returned. And I had done it with dignity, law, and a strength I hadn't known I still had. Below, I could see Felix dragging a suitcase across the lawn, muttering curses under his breath. Cambria followed a few steps behind, carrying a designer tote and what looked like an old photo album. I didn't ask what was in it. I didn't need to know. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I just stood there, letting the wind carry away whatever grief still lingered in the bones of that house. I had entered this place as an outsider, stayed as a ghost, and now I stood here as its rightful holder. Not because I fought dirty, but because I finally fought smart. As Rowan joined me on the balcony, she glanced at the horizon and nodded. "This is the beginning, Dean, not the end." She was right. And for the first time in a long, long time, I believed it. By sundown, the house was quieter than it had ever been, not because it was empty, but because the noise that had long occupied it had finally been removed. Cambria and Felix had packed what they could carry in the hours they were given. No fanfare, no limo waiting at the curb. Just rolling suitcases, cardboard boxes, and bruised egos bruising further with each step they took toward the gate. Rowan oversaw everything with calm detachment, clipboard in hand, ensuring everything they removed was documented and legal. No heirlooms, no artwork, nothing that had been jointly paid for. And certainly not the antique sideboard I had commissioned during our second year of marriage, an anniversary gift Cambria never once acknowledged. That stayed right where it was, a silent witness to what was finally coming undone. Cambria tried one more time. Just before leaving, she walked up the steps of the front porch like it was still hers, like all this could somehow be undone with the right words. She wore sunglasses, even though the sun was behind the trees, and her voice trembled in that way that used to crack my resolve. But not anymore. "I'm not here to fight," she said. I want to understand how it got to this point." I stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame with my arms folded. "Steady. It got here because you let it. Because silence is complicity. You stood by while your brother broke a bottle over my head, and then you walked away." She shook her head, her voice sharper now. I didn't know what to do. Everything happened so fast. "No," I interrupted, calm but cold. "Everything happened exactly how it was always going to happen. The only difference is this time, there were consequences." Felix, dragging a box down the path, shouted over his shoulder, "You'll regret this, Dean." "You think you've won something? You're just playing lawyer games." Rowan stepped forward before I could say a word. "Actually, this lawyer game you're referring to is called trust enforcement, and it's binding. You're welcome to contest it, if you can find a lawyer willing to stake their license on your behavior." Felix sneered but said nothing. The bruises on his ego were now visible in the way he moved, less cocky, more frantic. He looked like a man trying to carry dignity in a box that didn't quite close. Cambria turned back to me. "So that's it? You throw us out like strangers?" I nodded. "Exactly like that." She stood there a beat longer, waiting for me to flinch, to soften. But the man she married, the man who always made room for her excuses, was gone. In his place stood someone she hadn't cared to know until it was too late. When she realized I wasn't a fixture, I was a force. Security escorted them to the gate, walking silently beside them until the locks buzzed shut behind their exit. There were no reporters, no scandal, no headlines. Just a quiet exit from a place they had believed was theirs by birthright, never questioning who really paid for the walls that protected them. I didn't speak as they walked down the drive, didn't wave, didn't even step off the porch. I stayed rooted where I was, letting them carry their entitlement and shock out past the hedges. Their car pulled away, and I didn't watch it disappear. I didn't need to. Inside, the house had a different hum to it now. The kind of silence that didn't press on your chest. The kind that made space. The staff, those who had remained, were respectful, if a little cautious. Rowan had spoken to each of them, made it clear that any future here was based on integrity and accountability. 2 of the old housekeepers had already left, choosing loyalty to Cambria over a paycheck. That was fine by me. I didn't want anyone left whose silence had helped enable the rot. That night, I walked through every room with the slow reverence of someone reacquainting themselves with a body that had once been injured. The formal dining room, where I had sat through 100 awkward dinners filled with subtle jabs and louder silences. The library, where Cambria had once laughed at my taste in paperbacks, saying they looked cheap against leather-bound volumes. The kitchen, where I had made anniversary dinners alone while she texted beneath the dim glow of chandeliers. I stood in the center of the master bedroom and exhaled, hands in my pockets. This place had never truly felt like mine. I had funded it, maintained it, improved it, but I'd always been treated like a tenant in someone else's legacy. Tonight, though, it was different. The deed had my name. The keys were in my pocket. And the people who once wielded ownership like a sword were now locked out by their own arrogance. I didn't gloat. There was no music, no celebratory drink, no calls to friends. Just a moment of stillness, deep and earned. I made my way back downstairs and stepped out onto the master balcony, the breeze curling in like a quiet congratulations. The moonlight spilled over the lawn, washing everything in silver and peace. I leaned against the railing and let the night speak to me the way it hadn't in years. The old me, the version that needed permission to feel worthy, he wouldn't have believed this moment was possible. He would have hesitated, second-guessed, offered a compromise. But that man had bled on marble steps and walked away with more than scars. He walked away with clarity. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here for reclamation. The house didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like a clean slate. And for the first time since the vows were exchanged and the lies took root, I finally felt like I was home. Not in Cambria's world. Not in Felix's shadow. In mine. I didn't keep the house to bask in some grand sense of victory. I didn't walk its corridors at night pretending I had won anything. Truthfully, there were moments when the silence inside those walls echoed a little too loud, like the emptiness was asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. But still, I stayed. Not to preserve what had been, but to transform it into something that mattered. Something that would outlive the pain it once held. The idea came to me slowly, like fog lifting off a morning lawn. It started with a question. What do you do with a house soaked in betrayal, layered in the echoes of dismissive laughter and cold silences? You don't sell it. You don't pretend it never cut you. You reclaim it. You carve meaning into its foundation. One night, while sitting on the floor of the old study, I remembered the man I'd met at the hospital. Another husband, bruised in more than just body. He'd told me in a broken whisper, "It's harder when no one believes it's abuse when it's happening to you." His words stuck. They burrowed under my skin. I looked around at the marble floors, the high ceilings, the space Cambria once used for hosting, for displaying her version of perfection, and I realized I had a chance to do something bigger than just own the place. I could make it matter. That's when I called Rowan. She listened as I explained, then said, "I know someone." 2 days later, I met Arturo, a retired social worker with a gentle face and steel in his spine. He'd worked for 20 years with men recovering from psychological and emotional abuse. "People think men don't bleed," he told me during our first walk through the property. "Just because the wounds aren't visible, they assume you're fine. They forget silence can be a scream." We shook hands that day and never looked back. I gutted the West Wing first, the wing Cambria had insisted on turning into a private gallery. We stripped the walls bare, peeled back the layers of curated wallpaper, and let the light back in. Arturo helped me redesign the space, 4 rooms, each with a bed, a desk, and windows that actually opened. No locked doors. No judgment. Just safety. A small shared kitchen, a group therapy room where the old library had been. We added security measures quietly, respectfully, and brought in trauma counselors who believed in the cause as much as we did. I named it the Haven on Ridgemore. Every man who walked through those gates deserved a chance to breathe again, to speak without shame, to find their footing after being gaslit, neglected, or treated like furniture in their own homes. We didn't advertise. Words spread in the shadows, referrals from shelters, whispers through court clerks, quiet endorsements from therapists who knew how rare a space like this was. Within a month, we had our first resident. By the end of the third, all 4 rooms were full. The first man was David. 48. Divorced. A teacher who had spent a decade in a marriage where every paycheck was taken, every opinion dismissed. His wife had told him he was worthless so many times, he started to believe her. When he walked in with a duffel bag and a folder of court documents, he looked at me and said, "You sure this is real?" I nodded, handed him the keys to his room, and said, "This place was built for you." It wasn't always easy. Some days the air in the house was thick with pain. The kind that doesn't show on faces, only in pauses between words and the way hands tremble over coffee mugs. But it was real. It was honest. And it was healing. I kept one relic from the night it all began. The broken bottle. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It sat inside a clear display case near the front entryway, atop a mahogany table that once held Cambria's prized collection of imported vases. Below it, I had a small plaque engraved, "From glass, growth. From pain, purpose." Sometimes visitors would ask about it. Sometimes they wouldn't. But every man who stayed here knew what it meant. They didn't need to be told. You could see it in the way their shoulders dropped after a few days. In the way they finally started answering questions without apology. In the way they looked in mirrors like they were finally seeing someone again. Rowan came by one afternoon to check on the paperwork for our nonprofit status. She paused by the bottle and smiled. "Never thought this would be your legacy," she said. I looked around the room, warm sunlight spilling across the couch, Arturo laughing softly with one of the residents in the kitchen, and replied, "Neither did I, but I'm proud of it." She nodded, then handed me the final certification forms. The Haven's official now, fully recognized, tax exempt. You even got your inspection waived because of the Trust Foundation. I ran a hand across the smooth wood of the table. Funny. All of this because Felix couldn't hold his liquor. Rowan smirked. Or his temper. We both laughed. But beneath the laugh, there was something deeper. Something steady. Something earned. The house still held its luxury. The walls still whispered with memories. But now, those whispers had been rewritten. Every light that switched on, every door that opened, every meal shared, it was all a part of the healing. It didn't erase the past, but it layered something better over it. Stronger. Cambria never returned. Not in person. But one day, months later, I received a letter. No return address. No apology. Just a single photo tucked inside. Me and her on our wedding day, standing on the front steps of this same house, smiling in a way that no longer felt like me. I held it for a long time before I slipped it back into the envelope and set it aside. I didn't need to shred it. I didn't need to burn it. I had already moved on. The Haven stood. And with it, so did I. It was just after 8 on a rainy Thursday evening when the past arrived at my gate, wrapped in black and looking like regret. I had just finished restocking supplies in the communal kitchen when Malik buzzed my phone. "There's someone here," he said. "Says her name is Cambria." The name landed in my chest like a distant echo, familiar and irrelevant at the same time. "She's alone," Malik added. "No umbrella, no car in sight." I hesitated for a second, then told him, "I'll meet her at the gate." I walked down the main path slowly, letting the gravel crunch beneath my shoes, steadying myself with each step. The rain wasn't heavy, more of a persistent drizzle, soaking into everything without making a scene. When I reached the gate, she was there, drenched, pale, hair flattened against her forehead, mascara trailing down her cheeks. She didn't flinch at the sight of me. She didn't smile either. "I didn't know it would go this far," she said. I didn't answer immediately. I just studied her. Her coat was unbuttoned, clinging to her like a second skin. The Cambria I remembered would have never allowed herself to be seen in such a state. And yet, here she was, stripped of poise, wearing rain and silence like they were the only things left that fit her. "It always goes this far," I said calmly, "when you let it keep going." She looked away at that, toward the hedges lining the driveway, the same ones we once walked past together while discussing tile patterns and exterior lighting as if they mattered more than trust. "I didn't come here to fight," she said. "Good," I replied, "because I stopped fighting for your approval a long time ago." She swallowed, jaw tightening, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I found this when I was packing what little I had left. Thought maybe. I don't know. Maybe you'd want it." I took the envelope and opened it, not for her sake, but for mine. Inside was a single photo, us, 5 years ago, standing in the foyer of the estate. I had my arm around her waist. She was laughing, her eyes cast upward toward mine. I remembered that moment. It was the day we got the keys. We'd just walked through every room together, high on ideas and hope. It was before the cracks, before her silence became weaponized. Before Felix's jokes stopped being funny and started feeling like gut punches. I stared at the photo for a long time, then looked back at her. "You didn't come here for closure, Cambria. You came here hoping I'd give you back the last part of this place you can't reach anymore." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. "This house isn't yours," I continued. "Not anymore. And not because of a court ruling or a trust clause. Because you abandoned it long before the law ever caught up to you." She nodded slowly, blinking through the rain. I know. I should have been angry. I should have felt some rush of vindication, some primal satisfaction watching her stand in the rain, powerless, apologetic, broken. But I didn't. What I felt was heavier than triumph. What I felt was finality. "I don't hate you," I said. "That's the hardest part. I just don't believe you anymore." She flinched then, as if those words hurt more than anything else I could have said. I didn't enjoy that either. I wasn't there to wound her. I was there to end it. "I wish you peace," I added. "But you won't find it here." She closed her eyes and nodded again. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. No umbrella. No shoes built for gravel and mud. Just a woman in the rain, retreating from something she thought would always belong to her. I didn't call out to her. I didn't ask where she'd go. I simply stood at the gate until her silhouette vanished behind the mist. When I turned back toward the house, the porch lights cast a warm glow across the path. The haven stood like a quiet sentinel, solid and full of purpose. Inside, Arturo was still speaking softly to one of the new arrivals, and the soft sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen gave the place life. I walked back in, setting the envelope on the side table near the display case, the one that held the broken bottle. I didn't tear the photo. I didn't burn it. I didn't even frame it. I just left it there, unremarkable. A memory no longer powerful enough to move me. That night, I stood on the balcony again, the rain misting my face as I looked out over the lawn. The wind was cool, the scent of wet earth rising beneath it. Behind me, the rooms were full of healing, men unpacking more than bags, voices reclaiming space in the world. And I felt it in my chest, the unmistakable hum of closure. Cambria had finally come back, not for reconciliation, but for recognition. She wanted proof that she mattered still. What she got instead was the realization that I no longer needed her presence to define my peace. She never came back after that night, and I never looked for her in the rain again. The morning of the grand opening felt nothing like I thought it would. There were no nerves, no racing thoughts, no imagined catastrophes. Just a calm kind of anticipation, like the universe had taken a deep breath and was holding it for me. The haven looked beautiful. Simple, strong, intentional. The fresh paint still carried the faint scent of renewal. Flowers lined the walkway in muted colors. Chairs had been set up beneath the awning in the courtyard. No banners, no balloons, just presents. The guest list was small by design. A few dozen men who had come through our doors and walked out steadier than when they entered. A few allies, therapists, former social workers, quiet donors who believed in the mission without needing their names on anything. No press, no photographers, just stories stitched together by survival and strength. Arturo was already in the garden, adjusting the last of the name tags. He looked up when he saw me, giving a quiet nod that said more than any speech could. I nodded back and slipped inside to check on everything. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. Plates of soft pastries and fruit trays waited on the table. Nothing extravagant, just enough. I found myself pausing in the hallway near the front door, eyes drawn to the display case. The broken bottle still sat there, upright inside the glass, frozen in mid-destruction. The label was long gone. Only the jagged mouth and fractured base remained. And beneath it, the engraved plaque, from glass, growth. From pain, purpose. I touched the glass with the back of my fingers, not for the object itself, but for what it marked. That was the moment my life had pivoted. Not just the blow, but the silence that followed it. That split second where I knew no one would save me, so I had to learn how to save myself. I stepped outside as the guests began arriving. Malik stood at the front gate, greeting each one with a calm authority that had become a signature of the house. He wore a soft navy button-down and slacks today, dressed like a man who had traded battlefields for sanctuary. The first few men trickled in with their heads held higher than they'd once carried them. Some came alone, others brought partners. One man, Ray, brought his teenage son, who, only 6 months earlier, had watched his father leave a home filled with cold accusations and silent blame. Now they walked side by side. We didn't give speeches. That wasn't what the Haven was for. But we did share. Quietly, casually. One man leaned over the table and said to another, This place saved my life. Another pulled Arturo into a hug so tight it made my throat catch. I didn't interrupt. I just watched, absorbing every second. Every smile that wasn't forced. Every tear that didn't fall in shame. Every breath that came easier because they weren't pretending anymore. About an hour into the gathering, a reporter arrived, someone Arturo had invited as a personal favor. She kept her camera off, her notebook in her lap. She spoke only when spoken to, respectful, deliberate. Near the end, she approached me while I was pouring coffee. "Mr. Langford," she said, "if I may ask, after everything that happened, do you hold any resentment toward your ex-wife? Her brother?" I thought about it longer than I expected to. Not because I was unsure, but because it deserved a real answer. I turned to her, met her gaze, and said, "No." She blinked, waiting for more. I set the coffee pot down. I don't have a grudge, but I do have a scar. I have a deed. And I have a smile they'll never forget. That smile came then, unforced and full, a smile not born of pettiness or revenge, but the kind that comes when you've built something real from the wreckage. The kind that no one can steal. The kind that outlasts betrayal, silence, and blood. She wrote it down quietly, then folded her notebook and nodded. She didn't ask anything else. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the courtyard buzzed with quiet joy. No one wanted to leave. Some sat on the porch steps with plates of fruit, trading stories. Others stood near the garden, hands in pockets, just breathing. And I stood in the center of it all, not to be seen, but to witness what healing looked like. I thought of Cambria then, not with pain, but with distance. I wondered if she ever told anyone the truth. If she ever admitted that the man she once called a charity case had built something she'd never understand. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was here, brick by brick, breath by breath, and every man who walked in through the doors thinking he was broken and walked out knowing he wasn't alone. As dusk settled and the last of the guests filtered out, Arturo came to stand beside me. He handed me a small glass of wine and raised his own. "To the broken bottle," he said, half smiling, "and the man who made something whole from it." I clinked my glass against his. "To every man who learns he deserves better." We drank in silence. That night, I turned out the lights and stood alone in the main hallway. The shadows didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt earned. The scars on the walls, metaphorical and otherwise, weren't things to hide. They were part of the story. Proof that this house had once been a battlefield and now stood as a haven. I walked past the display case once more and nodded to it, just once, like a final bow to a ghost that no longer haunted me. Then I climbed the stairs, not as a man trying to prove something to the world, but as a man finally at peace with who he had become. And the smile on my face? That was the kind you never forget.